Picture this, a Saskatchewan company is sitting there, looking at a map of potential export terminals, and they've got two options. Option A, Prince Rupert or Vancouver, beautiful British Columbia ports, Canadian infrastructure, keeping everything north of the border. Option B, Longview, Washington, literally in another country. And they chose Washington. They looked at Canadian ports and said, nah, we're good, and decided to drop $1 billion in the United States instead. David Eby is absolutely fuming, and honestly, this might be the most Canadian economic cell phone of the year. Welcome back to Canadian Insights, where today we're talking about how a Saskatchewan fertilizer giant just friend-zoned British Columbia so hard that the Premier's out here giving interviews about his feelings. Buckle up, because this one's a roller coaster of economic dysfunction, political finger-pointing, and the kind of business decision that makes you wonder what we're even doing up here. Alright, let's set the stage. Nutrien Ltd, which is a massive Saskatchewan-based company and one of the world's largest potash producers, just announced they are building a $1 billion export terminal. That's billion with a B. That's the kind of investment that creates jobs, generates tax revenue, and puts a region on the map economically. So naturally, every jurisdiction with a port is throwing their hat in the ring trying to land this thing. British Columbia's got Prince Rupert, they've got Vancouver. Both are major West Coast ports with existing infrastructure and everything you'd need to move potash to international markets. Seems like a slam dunk, right? Wrong. Nutrien looked at all their options and went with Longview, Washington. Not even close to the border, fully in the United States, on the Columbia River. David Eby's reaction? He told reporters on Monday he was really disappointed. Which, in Canadian political speak, is basically the equivalent of flipping a table. Because here's a Saskatchewan company, Canadian company, making money off Canadian resources, and they're choosing to invest in American infrastructure instead of Canadian. That stings. That's the kind of thing that keeps premiers up at night wondering what went wrong. Now, let's talk about why this happened, because Nutrien didn't just throw a dart at a map. According to Vaughn Palmer's reporting, Nutrien says Longview makes more sense than BC ports for a host of cost reasons. Cost reasons. Translation. It's cheaper and easier to do business in Washington state than in British Columbia. Let that sink in. A Canadian company is finding it more economically viable to export through a foreign country than through their own. That's not just disappointing, that's a flashing neon sign that something's broken in how we do business in Canada. What are these cost reasons? Well, Palmer doesn't spell out every single detail, but we can connect the dots. Port fees in BC are notoriously high. Rail costs to get product from Saskatchewan to the coast aren't cheap either. There are regulatory hurdles, environmental assessments, consultation processes, all necessary things, but they add time and money. Meanwhile, Washington state is presumably offering competitive rates, streamlined processes, and infrastructure that's ready to go. So from Nutrien's perspective, it's simple math. If option A costs more and takes longer, and option B costs less and moves faster, you go with option B. Even if option B is in a different country. But here's where David Eby's pushing back, and has got some valid points. First, Eby said the whole country would benefit from investing in port expansion on the West Coast. He's absolutely right about that. When you invest in Canadian infrastructure, you're not just helping one company, you're building capacity that other businesses can use. You're creating jobs for Canadians. You're keeping economic activity and tax dollars in Canada. Every dollar Nutrien spends in Washington is a dollar that's not circulating in the Canadian economy. It's not paying Canadian workers, it's not supporting Canadian businesses, and it's not generating tax revenue for Canadian governments. That adds up. And then Eby dropped what might be the most interesting argument against this deal. He said choosing the US location means Saskatchewan potash will be hostage to the whims of President Donald Trump, who could impose tariffs on the exports or shut them down altogether. Now that is a spicy take, but it's not wrong. Trump's not exactly known for his predictable trade policy. We've already seen what happens when Trump decides to slap tariffs on Canadian exports: lumber, aluminum, steel, dairy, he's done it all. So what's to stop him from deciding that potash exports through American ports should face some kind of levy or restriction? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Imagine being Nutrien, building $1 billion terminal in Washington, getting everything up and running, and then Trump, or whoever's president at the time, wakes up one morning, tweets something about America first, and suddenly your entire export operation is subject to new tariffs or regulatory restrictions. You've just made yourself vulnerable to the political whims of a foreign government. That's a risk that doesn't exist if you're exporting through Canadian ports. Eby's basically saying you're trading short-term cost savings for long-term strategic vulnerability, and that's actually a pretty compelling argument. But here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Canadian politics wants to admit. If Nutrien genuinely finds it easier and cheaper to operate in Washington state than in British Columbia, that's a massive indictment of how we've structured our economy. This isn't about one company making one decision. This is about competitiveness. If Canadian businesses are looking south of the border for infrastructure investments, that means we're losing on the fundamentals, cost, efficiency, regulatory environment, all of it. And premiers can express disappointment all they want, but until those fundamentals change, companies are going to keep making these decisions. There's also the Saskatchewan angle here that's quietly hilarious. Saskatchewan and BC haven't exactly been best friends lately, especially with all the pipeline drama we've covered. Scott Moe's been part of secret conversations about BC's coast without inviting BC to the table. And now a Saskatchewan company is bypassing BC entirely for their exports. It's like the two provinces are in a passive-aggressive standoff, except instead of angry texts, they're making billion-dollar infrastructure decisions that exclude each other. Canadian interprovincial relations at their finest, folks. And let's not forget the federal government's role in all this. Where's Ottawa? Because this seems like exactly the kind of thing where federal leadership should step in and say, hey, maybe we should make it attractive for Canadian companies to use Canadian infrastructure. There are policy levers available, tax incentives, infrastructure funding, regulatory streamlining, but those require political will and coordination between provinces and the federal government. And based on what we've seen lately, coordinated federal-provincial action is about as common as a snowstorm in July. So what's the takeaway here? $1 billion investment just went to Washington state instead of British Columbia, and David Eby's left explaining to reporters why that's a problem. Nutrien made a business decision based on cost and efficiency, which you can't really blame them for. Companies exist to make money. But the fact that they found it easier to operate in a foreign country than at home should be a wake-up call for every level of Canadian government. We can keep expressing disappointment, or we can actually fix the underlying issues that make Canadian infrastructure less competitive. Your move, policymakers. What do you think? Should Nutrien have prioritized Canadian infrastructure even if it costs more, or did they make the right business call? And is Eby right that relying on US ports makes Saskatchewan vulnerable to Trump's trade whims? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button, subscribe to Canadian Insights for daily updates on Canadian political and economic news, because clearly there's never a shortage of drama. Ring that notification bell so you catch every upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.